Warmest greetings. My name is Alexander Carpenter. I'm a musicologist and professor of music at the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta. I currently serve as the chair of the Academic Advisory Board of the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies, and in July I will step into the role of director of the Institute at the end of Dr. Pattrich's term. It's a great honor to be asked to present a lecture in this series. The title of my talk, Beethoven Redux, is my attempt to encapsulate the phenomenon of Beethoven as a symbolic figure who has been and continues to be put to contradictory, if not sometimes outright antagonistic purposes in historiography, in politics, and in the popular imagination. In this talk, given in the wake of the Beethoven year, which just ended a few months ago, I'll trace this phenomenon from the 18th century to the present day. In 2014, New Yorker music critic Alex Ross wrote an essay entitled Deus ex Musica, in which he complained about Beethoven's bad influence, his words, over classical music, attributing this in part to the development of a Beethoven cult that has, since the early 19th century, elevated the composer to the status of what Ross calls a secular god. The problematic upshot of this, says Ross, is that Beethoven has cast a shadow, quote, on those who came after him and even on those who came before him. Already in his own lifetime, the hyperbole was intensifying, end quote. Ross's main concern is the extent to which Beethoven's deification has diminished contemporary music, that Beethoven's music is performed to the exclusion of the living. And though it's not Beethoven's fault or intention, the composer nonetheless, quote, oppresses his successors from the grave, end quote. So my point here is not to diminish or deconstruct Beethoven's musical legacy in any way. In my view, the greatness of his music, its powerful expressiveness, achieved paradoxically through the most intricate motivic construction with a strong-handed but careful negotiation of form, speaks for itself. And indeed, one could be forgiven for being a member of the Beethoven cult, becoming addicted, as Ross avers, to the composer's irresistible and genre-defining developmental logic, building monumental structures out of tiny musical ideas in a way that compels and rewards repeated listening. Beethoven's monumentality is the focus of my talk. The remembered Beethoven, Beethoven rendered as an icon, and as is popular to say these days, the constructed Beethoven. I won't begin at the beginning. Rather, I'll start from the present, where we find Beethoven embroiled, rather improbably, in racial politics, as simultaneously a black man and as the emblem of classical music's white supremacy. How did we get to this point? To help answer this question, I will jump backwards into the late 18th century to a politically equivocal Beethoven at the crossroads of classicism and romanticism, to Beethoven as a modernist and anti-modernist in the early 20th century, and finally to Beethoven as Führer and anti-Führer in the mid-20th century, in the midst of the Nazification of Europe. With respect to this ongoing and perhaps even originary ambivalence concerning the composer's identity and what he and his music means, I'm hoping to show that really there has always been a double Beethoven, and as a corollary, to also address the cogent question recently posed by the German journalist Gabi Reucher, namely, who does Beethoven belong to? Most of us are aware of the ascendancy of Black Lives Matter, a social justice movement that began in 2012 in the wake of the killing of Black teenager Trayvon Martin, that has since grown into a global movement. The profile of BLM increased dramatically in the summer of 2020 in response to the death of George Floyd at the hands of police, with subsequent marches, rallies, and riots across the United States. Less well known is the fact that during that same summer, the meme Beethoven was black began trending on social media. This notion that Beethoven was a person of mixed race has circulated at the fringes of scholarly discourse for over a century, resurging at opportune moments in the history of social justice, In the early 1960s, for example, during the emergence of the Black Power movement, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael both claimed that Beethoven, along with Hannibal and Jesus, was Black, as part of their efforts to assert the vitality of Black cultural history. Some of the evidence for Beethoven as a person of color is a bit gossipy and mainly centers on the ethnicity of the composer's father, perhaps a person of Moorish descent, with whom Beethoven's mother had an affair. But they also derive from putative contemporary accounts, what we would consider in what we would consider a decidedly racist vein today. Contemporary accounts of the composer's facial structure, his hair, his dark skin tone, namely his, quote, broad nose, and his unruly, that is to say, kinky hair. Beethoven was reputedly called the Moor, or the Blackamoor, by some of his contemporaries, perhaps suggesting that his peers regarded him as having black features. Beethoven was also known to have a half-black friend, the violinist George Bridgetower, to whom Beethoven affectionately referred as that crazy mulatto composer, Bridgetower. Some commentators have even gone so far as to suggest that there are black elements to Beethoven's music itself, namely jazzy syncopations and intimations of reggae, hinting at an African genealogy. All of this is quite sketchy scholarship. Beethoven's family is known to be of Flemish descent, and his paternal and maternal lineage is easily traceable back to the 14th century. The supposition that Beethoven's mother may have had an affair is impossible to substantiate. In Beethoven's time, a Moor could have been anyone from Africa or someone of Arabic background from Iberia. And Moor was a sobriquet that was bestowed upon European men with generally dark features, or simply with heavy beards. Karl Marx's acquaintances, for instance, called him the Moor. Having a half-black friend and fellow musician with whom Beethoven performed obviously does not make you black. And the idea that syncopation, the technique of shifting accent or stress from the strong beats to the weak beats in a musical phrase, is somehow embedded in genetics rather than culture is simply ridiculous. So all of this, however, did not prevent a profusion of articles in the popular press, from Newsweek to the Smithsonian Magazine to The Guardian, that addressed the question of Beethoven's race, mostly concluding Beethoven was probably not black, but noting, as something of a non sequitur, that black musicians and composers are often not afforded a place in the history of classical music. As a commenter asserted in response to my own article about this phenomenon in The Conversation last summer, quote, that the race of Beethoven is contested at all means he was a black man, end quote. Why does this trope continue to circulate and resurface? As the Germanist and pianist Kira Thurman, whose research focuses on the history of the black diaspora in Europe, has noted, now quoting Thurman here, there is a way in which white people historically have constantly denied black people any kind of association with genius. And in a lot of ways, there is no figure that we associate more with genius than Beethoven himself. The implication of the idea that Beethoven might be black was so powerful, was so exciting and so tantalizing, because it threatens to overturn how people have understood or talked about race and racial hierarchy in the United States and around the world, end quote. So in this case then, even if Beethoven is not black, he serves as a kind of advocate for black cultural history and perhaps a kind of ally, as a means to investigate and reevaluate historiography towards a more racially inclusive notion of genius. But at the same time, this notion of black Beethoven was circulating online. The rarefied scholarly world of music theory and analysis was also addressing the issue of race and was arriving at a rather different conclusion. In 2019, the music theorist Philip Ewell gave a controversial plenary address to an audience of fellow music theorists on the subject of the Austrian music theorist Heinrich Schenker. Schenker, who died in 1935, created a reductive system of musical analysis that methodically strips musical works of surface details, working towards the underlying paradigmatic contrapuntal structures that comprise the foundations of masterworks of the tonal tradition. Ewell's talk focused on Schenker's racism. He was a German chauvinist, not terribly surprising, given that he was an Austro-Galician classical musician born in 1868. But he also published decidedly racist musings about the racially inferior peoples of Asia and Africa, and about the inability of primitive people to govern themselves. Ewell insisted that Schenker's racism and his theory were inseparable, and the fact that Schenker is so deeply ensconced in the teaching of music theory is furthermore indicative of the white supremacy of university music departments and the institutions of classical music. Ewell's talk and his subsequent journal article on the subject sparked an impassioned response from the music theory community during the summer of 2020, at the very same time Beethoven Was Black was trending. Some academics rejected Ewell's arguments in favor of the view that systems of musical analysis like Schenker's are essentially objective and can be taught to students without reference to Schenker's personal beliefs about race. Moreover, the fact that Schenker was a racist was unremarkable given his time period and his milieu. Others agreed with Ewell's claim that the fundamental problem is a, quote, white racial frame, end quote, that shapes the institution of music theory and that whitewashes Schenker's racism to the benefit of the dominant ideology of white culture. Why do I mention Ewell and this controversy here? Because Ewell's argument throws Beethoven under the bus with Schenker, so to speak, as exemplars of the European classical music tradition. If Beethoven is the greatest composer, says Ewell, then Schenker is the greatest theorist. Ewell's attack on Schenker and music theory is part of a broader indictment of the Germanophilia of university music departments in North America, which uncritically teach and venerate German composers, especially Beethoven, Ewell insists, and theorists, especially Schenker, to the exclusion of other composers and other musical traditions. Ewell insists specifically that the veneration of Beethoven is the result of his having been, in his words, quote, propped up by whiteness and maleness for 200 years, end quote. So, as of 2021, Beethoven is black, but Beethoven is also emblematic of the problem of white supremacy in the institutions of classical music. This knot is not something I intend to untangle here. The racial politics of classical music is an area in which I have no experience or expertise. But this entanglement does put the doubled Beethoven at center stage and re-asks the question, who does Beethoven belong to? With the real Beethoven, that is Beethoven as he lived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and not Beethoven the well-traveled symbol of genius or most recently the emblem of white European chauvinism, it is hard to know where to begin with respect to this notion of his ambivalent identity. It is the case, for instance, that Beethoven is often made to straddle the fence of the classical and romantic periods, placing him in a kind of liminal position as either the first romantic composer or the last of the classical composers as the third member of the Viennese school triumvirate that includes Mozart and Haydn. While Beethoven was receiving an artistic benediction from the hands of Haydn at the turn of the 19th century, as the latter's student and successor, he was at the very same time being characterized and mythologized as a prototypical romantic by his contemporaries. As William Newman has observed, quote, as far back as the critical and other writings from Beethoven's own day, the process of romanticizing him can be traced. However, whether it can be traced to anything Beethoven himself did or said remains debatable, end quote. From this process emerges, of course, a familiar portrait of Beethoven as a romantic heroic figure, a practitioner of magic, as E.T.A. Hoffmann would have it, and finally, as a kind of spiritual leader, a mystic prophet of music, in the words of Victor Hugo. But to mystify genius is to take it out of its historical and interactional contexts, notes Tia Denora. As a consequence, Denora observes, quote, posterity has been good to Beethoven, end quote. enriching the experience of his music by elevating his status to that of a singular genius, while at the same time diminishing the sociocultural context of the work and uncritically promoting the trope of genius. The quality of Beethoven's works in this process are the sole cause of his recognition, she writes, and greatness thus emerges out of a kind of temporal conjuring trick, end quote, in which the stylistic and aesthetic change that happens over time is, quote, projected backwards on earlier events, making a figure like Beethoven emerge as a genius via a perspective that is ultimately anachronistic and context-free. Taken in context, in the late 18th century, Beethoven can be seen as part of a much larger ideological shift, the development of a serious music culture, in Vienna, which included Mozart and Haydn. Beethoven was well known and well received in some circles during his early years in Vienna, but at the same time, there was certainly ambivalence about the quality of his compositions, and indeed even disagreement over whether Beethoven was even doing anything radically new at all. Beethoven arrived in Vienna in the 1790s, at a time characterized by his biographer Alexander Thayer, in which, quote, all the conditions for the elevation of the art of music were just at this time fulfilled, and in one department, that of instrumental music. They existed in a degree unknown in any other city, end quote. The economic context for music was itself in a liminal stage, caught between the old patronage system and the development of new systems for publication, dissemination, and promotion in the 19th century. Select composers in this exclusive and highly competitive milieu, composers such as Haydn and Antonio Salieri, could emerge as stars, combining the benefits of private aristocratic patronage and quasi-freelance opportunities. This set the stage, Denora argues, for, quote, a qualitatively different kind of musical greatness, end quote, and the establishment of what she calls, quote, the category of musical celebrity, end quote. If the sociocultural context of late 18th century Vienna played a role in establishing Beethoven's reputation as a musical superstar, so too did his position with respect to his aristocratic patrons. Beethoven cultivated the image of a fiercely independent, iconoclastic musician-composer. However, this was an image that at the same time appealed to aristocratic patrons who were keen to support serious music, a serious music culture that valorized musical innovation, unconventionality, and exclusivity. Beethoven was well positioned via his standing at the court in Bonn to arrive in Vienna and become successful. He was, in Denora's words, quote, plugged in, end quote, to a, quote, supportive patronage network, end quote, that was so efficient and profitable that she wonders, counterfactually, whether another composer so plugged in might have achieved the same historically unprecedented success. Moreover, the musicologist and Beethoven biographer Maynard Solomon has described what he calls, in his words, Beethoven's nobility pretense, fostering the belief that he was of noble background, a pretense that, according to Solomon, was not even necessary for Beethoven to gain access to noble salons. While Solomon regards this as a conundrum of Beethoven's personality, seeking psychological reasons for this duplicity, other scholars insist that this was a strategy that allowed Beethoven to modify the patron-composer relationship and to foster and shape the reception of his music within select circles of aristocratic patrons. This image, again, is at odds with the version of Beethoven as a standalone figure, or even as a composer who was a man of the people anti-aristocrat, as he is sometimes characterized with respect to his pro-Enlightenment views and support for the French Revolution. There are a number of rather well-traveled anecdotes that attest to Beethoven as an anti-aristocrat, including an account of the composer walking with Goethe, encountering a member of the nobility and pointedly refusing to remove his hat. Another has him famously blowing off Prince Karl Lichnowsky, one of his patrons, with the scalding indictment, quote, Prince, what you are by an accident of birth. What I am of myself. There are and will be thousands of princes, There is only one Beethoven. Ultimately, then, it seems that there are at least two contradictory historical Beethovens to contend with. The Romantic Beethoven, who stood aloof from the world of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, from its social norms and strictures, from class, in the name of creating a new, mystical, and universal music that effectively remade listeners' ears as it gave birth to the modern concert hall tradition and reset the course of music history. And there is the entrepreneurial, class-conscious Beethoven, methodically navigating the waters of late 18th century patronage and the Viennese aristocracy, and taking advantage of social conditions to create a specialist audience for his music and secure his reputation as a genius composer. Who does Beethoven belong to? In the fall of 2020, I gave a public lecture on the subject of Beethoven as a symbol of modernity in turn-of-the-century Vienna. In this instance, too, we are confronted with a doubling of Beethoven in which two paradoxical versions of the composer are called into being simultaneously. In this case, Beethoven is invoked as a kind of mascot of modernity by the Jung Wien generation, specifically by artists associated with Gustav Klimt and the secession movement. Conservative Vienna, and especially its establishment music critics, are, at the same time, using Beethoven as a bulwark against modernity. Vienna at the turn of the century was a city in which modernism was reputedly expressed in its purest form, the very focal point of European modernism. The young generation of Viennese modernists oriented themselves towards the future and towards the wider world, struggling against tradition and entrenched institutions determined to hang on to the homey, bourgeois traditions, exemplified by the Biedermeier culture of the first half of the 19th century that had long defined the city. As the journalist Karl Kraus complained in the early 20th century, his fellow Viennese seemed to prefer to live like it was perpetually 1830. From this fin de siècle tumult, Beethoven arose, resurrected as a potent symbol of the Viennese modernists. In 1897, a group of artists had formed the Vienna secession movement, breaking away from the traditional art scene of the city and establishing their own Art Nouveau building to exhibit modern art and to celebrate the avant-garde. In 1902, to honor the 75th anniversary of the death of Beethoven, two major artworks were featured in the secession building: Gustav Klimt's Beethoven frieze and Max Klinger's statue of Beethoven. The building itself was transformed inside to resemble a temple, with Klinger's Beethoven at the center and Klimt's massive 6-panel mural adorning 3 walls in the adjoining room. The overarching theme of the exhibition was the struggle to overcome negative internal and external forces towards the pursuit of joy and fulfillment, which can be realized through art, or rather, through music. Klimt, in his mural, seems to be alluding to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, perhaps in recognition of the symphony's, quote, obstreperous roarings of modern frenzy, end quote, as one critic described it in 1825. Klimt does not admit as much, but art historians agree that it is likely a paraphrase of Beethoven's Final Symphony, though it's very abstract. The work was pivotal for Klimt and for the development of Viennese aesthetic modernism as a whole. It sums up his earlier period and marks the beginning of his so-called golden period, the works of which are most strongly associated with Vienna at this time. And the mural contains shadowy intimations of future works, perhaps most notably his famous painting, The Kiss. Beethoven, for Klimt, serves as a locus of the modern, through the symbolic representation of Beethoven, his apotheosis. The Viennese modern art movement binds itself to the notion of music as, quote, a kingdom not of this world, end quote, as the most attuned to the inner world of all the arts. Klimt's artistic transition, likewise, was a decisive turn inwards to probe the depths of the unconscious. The critical response to Klimt's mural was predictably negative. Like much of Klimt's work, it was condemned as pornographic, as reaching the pinnacle of obscenity in art. It is clear, though, that the issue is not simply that the mural contains nudes. Rather, like the criticism of Klinger's Beethoven, what is at play is Beethoven's, quote, universal adaptability, End quote. For Klimt, Beethoven underwrites the modernist project. For Klimt's critics, Beethoven is the sacred cow, a bulwark against this very modernism. What is truly obscene is not the bare breasts and the pubic hair in the mural, but the lack of proper respect for Beethoven. But the Beethoven exhibition at the Secession gets even more complicated on deeper investigation. Klimt provocatively gave his figure of the knight in shining armor, who stands in the mural against the hostile forces, a titanic gorilla and lascivious women who represent human degradation. He gave the knight in shining armor the face of his contemporary, the composer Gustav Mahler. Mahler was widely despised by the Viennese musical press, who disparaged him as much too modern. Mahler had conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Vienna 2 years earlier and had been brutally attacked by critics for his approach. They said, quote, "Melody is detached and isolated from the sound fabric as if with a scalpel. Mahler has asserted himself as a modernist, at least insofar as this modern age drives towards science." End quote. Mahler, like Klimt and Klinger, is too modern and insufficiently awestruck in the presence of Beethoven, and too Jewish, for that matter, for Vienna's cultured anti-Semites, who complained that, quote, "Instead of silencing Mahler, the grandeur of the Ninth Symphony has aroused his intellect, and he has scaled its heights with clever interpretations and details." Mahler certainly wasn't the only modern Jewish composer the Viennese critics despised, and against whom they pitted the legacy of Beethoven. On December 21st in 1908, Vienna's Bösendorfer Hall hosted a performance of a new string quartet by the young composer Arnold Schoenberg, paired with Beethoven's Opus 74 string quartet, which is nicknamed the Harp. Schoenberg, who we now know as the father of modern music, was in 1908 a fledgling composer, whose music had been moving ever closer to atonality, or what Schoenberg called the emancipation of dissonance, music free from the confines of key, in which every note is equal and has meaning in relation to the notes around it, not as part of a prescribed tonal hierarchy. This music was also expressionistic, like the art of Klimt and his contemporaries, and no doubt under the influence of Freudian psychoanalysis. Schoenberg sought to turn the self inside out, to allow music to be subjective and to freely express the deep, dark truths of the unconscious. His Opus 10 string quartet was revolutionary in a number of ways. It wasn't entirely atonal, but the final two movements came close to atonality, and it included a singer. Schoenberg was the first composer to add a singing part to a string quartet, an echo of Beethoven's own addition of singers to the final movement of the Ninth Symphony. And the text he chose for the quartet's last two movements by the German poet Stefan George speak of the suffering endured by the modern artist and of the desire to leave the world behind. Perhaps the most famous moment in the quartet is near the beginning of the final moment, when the soprano hauntingly sings, "I feel the air of other planets," as the strings gently seem to slip the bonds of tonality. At the premiere of the Opus 10 quartet, a riot broke out. Audience members began laughing and then jeering, booing, and hissing, while Schoenberg devotees tried to counter with loud applause. Members of the audience, including a contingent of partisan music critics, led the assault, calling for the soprano Maria Gutteil-Schoder to stop singing. "Stop," they shouted. "We've had enough. Don't make fools of us." Gutteil-Schoder burst into tears, but continued performing the quartet to its completion, and immediately afterwards, the music critic Paul Stauber shouted to Ludwig Bösendorfer, the owner of the concert hall, "Beethoven is next on the program. You had better ventilate the auditorium." As this remark suggests, Vienna's conservative critics and audiences regarded Beethoven as antipode, and perhaps antidote, to Schoenberg's modern music, which the critic Hans Liebstockel described as, quote, "bitter, tasteless, confused ugliness," end quote. Here's the rub. Schoenberg's ultra-modern quartet, one of Schoenberg's earliest so-called atonal works, breathing the air of other planets with its free-floating dissonances as it ushers in the era of musical modernism, is underwritten by Beethoven. Schoenberg's quartet was premiered side by side with the Beethoven quartet, and the original concert program contained a reprint of a historic negative review of that Beethoven quartet, immediately suggesting an affinity between the two composers by virtue of a shared history of being misheard and mistreated by critics. Moreover, Schoenberg's quartet contains motivic quotations, small germinal musical ideas derived from Beethoven's quartets. In his textbook, Structural Functions of Harmony, Schoenberg makes it very clear that the tonal dissolution evident in his music, which so vexed audiences and critics in early 20th century Vienna, was already present in Beethoven's music as what he called endangered tonality, harmonic progressions that undermine and weaken sense of key. So Schoenberg could very well be talking about the harmonic procedures in his own Opus 10 string quartet there, thereby bringing Beethoven into the present as a fellow modern. And if that weren't enough, consider again Schoenberg's inclusion of a vocal part in his string quartet for the first time in history. It was a revolutionary gesture, to be sure, playing a key role in the advent of musical modernism, but embedded in this revolutionary modern gesture is the specter of Beethoven, who had added voices to his final symphony almost 85 years earlier. Schoenberg, for his entire life, was a devotee of what he called new music, music that strove to express something new in a new way. This was the hallmark, the honor code, in his words, of great art. For Schoenberg, inventing the modern style in a fin de siècle Vienna, determined to monumentalize Beethoven as part of the city's classical heritage and reputation as the city of music. For Schoenberg, Beethoven's music was new music. Beethoven and Schoenberg come together again in 1942 in Schoenberg's cantata Ode to Napoleon. In 1942, the Vienna-born Schoenberg was living in Los Angeles. He had been living and teaching in Berlin, but he left Europe in 1933 after Hitler's National Socialists came to power in Germany and began purging the country's cultural and educational institutions of Jews. In early 1942, Schoenberg was commissioned by the League of Composers to write a piece of chamber music. During the spring of that year, he composed Ode to Napoleon, a setting of Byron's eponymous poem for a reciter, accompanied by piano and string quartet, and cast in the 12-tone idiom. That is, the work is atonal, composed using serialized iterations of the chromatic scale, pre-compositionally organized into row forms. Byron's poem, written in 1814, was composed in the immediate wake of Bonaparte's defeat at Waterloo and his subsequent abdication. In the ode, the poet indicts all tyrants and dictators, even as he mourns Napoleon's fall from grace and failure to fulfill his destiny. In the opening lines, Byron likens Napoleon to Satan, insisting that Napoleon's fall is the greatest since Lucifer's. He then berates Napoleon not only for his inglorious capitulation, he should have died in battle, or at least have successfully committed suicide, and for betraying those who had believed in him. Ultimately, it is Byron's ambivalence towards Napoleon that becomes evident. While the poem opens with Byron remarking that Napoleon was, quote, yesterday a king, end quote, but now, quote, thou art a nameless thing, end quote. The poet closes by comparing Napoleon to Prometheus. Schoenberg, in turn, seems to use Byron's ode to satirize dictators, Hitler specifically, rather than express disillusionment over his failure as a leader. As June Park has observed, there are in fact humorous moments in Schoenberg's ode, and she compares the cantata with Charlie Chaplin's classic film The Great Dictator, which dates from the same year. In Park's account, both Schoenberg and Chaplin, quote, adopt mock elevation as satire by using the word great or ode in the title of their works. Since both artists were working on projects that criticize Nazi Germany, it is understandable that the two adopted a similar mode of critique, end quote. Park argues that Schoenberg did not, as of 1942, have a clear sense of the true horrors of the Nazi regime and its genocidal treatment of European Jewry, and so constructed his critique of Hitler as, quote, an indirect protest from a conceptual distance, end quote. But the Ode to Napoleon also functions as critique via Schoenberg's striking inclusion of a musical quotation from Beethoven, and also by the work's more abstract allusion to Beethoven through its harmonic signifiers. I say striking because Schoenberg rarely includes quotations in his music. In fact, the very few times when he does, often fragments of folk song or a passing self-quotation, it is satirical. In the Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte, Schoenberg quotes the very recognizable rhythmic motive of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, coinciding with the poetic text, the earthquake voice of victory. Schoenberg's use of the Beethoven motive likely corresponds to the use of that same motive by the BBC to symbolize victory. The short, 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 long rhythm is Morse code for this, that signals the letter V. But Schoenberg invokes Beethoven in the ode in another way, namely by manipulating his 12-tone rows to generate traditional tonal chords, triads, or stacks of thirds, the building blocks of tonal music. And specifically, it's the recurrence of the E-flat major triad that musicologists link to Beethoven's Third Symphony, which is known as the Eroica, the Heroic Symphony, which is in the key of E-flat major. The Eroica Symphony, composed in 1803, is itself a Napoleonic work. Beethoven famously dedicated it in admiration to Napoleon, but supposedly removed the dedication in dismay after Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Beethoven is famously reputed to have torn the title page of the symphony in anger, removing Napoleon's name as a dedicatee and exclaiming, quote, "He's just a rascal like all the others," end quote. It is, however, a myth that Beethoven ever abandoned his admiration of Napoleon. Indeed, as the literary scholar and historian John Clubb has observed, both Beethoven and Byron remained obsessed with Napoleon for their entire lives. The composer sometimes identified with Napoleon, likening his musical compositions to the French emperor's military victories. This fact makes Schoenberg's use of Beethoven as a symbol of Enlightenment sensibilities and resistance to tyranny somewhat problematic, if not off-key, though at the same time, this ambivalence could be seen as strangely apposite if we follow June Park's argument that Schoenberg's ode was offering a critique of Nazism that was, in essence, an unstable admixture of satire, humor, and sincerity, signified in part by Schoenberg's incongruent use of tonal chords in an atonal piece of music. What makes Schoenberg's gesture towards Beethoven even more ambivalent, or at least adds another layer of meaning and complexity, is the fact that, as of 1942, just as Schoenberg was deploying Beethoven as an attack on Nazi tyranny, Hitler and the Nazis were themselves using Beethoven as a weapon against degenerate art and non-German culture. Indeed, in late April of 1942, as Schoenberg was midway through composing his ode, the Nazi Party was celebrating Hitler's birthday with a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler. The Nazis, in order to use Beethoven as a symbol of the Reich, had purified his family's ethnic background, asserted the fundamentally aggressive Germanness of Beethoven's music, and had recast his pro-Enlightenment politics as pro-Napoleon. Beethoven, the Nazis claimed, had admired Napoleon precisely because he was a tyrant, who had dealt with the post-revolutionary chaos in France, just as the Nazis had overcome the chaos of the Weimar era with a, quote, strong hand, end quote. In this account, Beethoven is not a Democrat, but rather an aristocrat sympathizer, supportive of oligarchic authoritarianism as sometimes necessary in order to bring about state order. As David Dennis has demonstrated, Nazi-era scholars went so far as to suggest that Beethoven's Napoleonic Eroica Symphony constituted a deep psychological yearning within the composer for a, quote, born Führer personality, end quote, and that Beethoven himself was even a, quote, Führer type, both artistic and political, end quote. Beethoven was also linked directly with Hitler through the Fifth Symphony's narrative, which Nazi scholars appropriated as a depiction of, quote, the fight for existence waged by a folk that looks for its Führer and finally finds it, end quote. Beethoven as a symbol of victory against Hitlerian tyranny, or Beethoven as Hitler, Who does Beethoven belong to? Thus, Schoenberg's satirical tack on Hitlerian tyranny becomes a kind of deconstructive, or rather deconstructed gesture, undermined in part by the multiplicity of meaning that radiates, then as now, from Beethoven. I'm not inclined to wholly accept Slavoj Žižek's rather nihilistic suggestion that Beethoven, and his Ninth Symphony in particular, is simply an empty signifier, a signifier so overdetermined that it absorbs rather than emits meaning, such that the composer and his music can be readily appropriated by anyone, for any purpose. But such appropriation, as an ongoing historical phenomenon, brings us back to Beethoven in the age of BLM, where we find the composer simultaneously claimed as Black in the name of social justice and more inclusive musical scholarship, and decried as the representative of a colonizing Eurocentrism that has oppressively bent the history of music in favor of white German geniuses. If the anecdote about Beethoven's dying words is true, that he claimed, quote, "Applaud, friends, the comedy is over," end quote, then I suppose he couldn't have been more wrong. The story continues. In death, the composer is deified, like the ill-fated emperor he quoted on his deathbed. His work lives on, as the composer is doubled over and over again. The critic Alex Ross gloomily asks how Beethoven can overcome his, quote, "monumental meaninglessness," end quote, while in the same breath observing that much of Beethoven's music requires and invites a, quote, "lifetime of contemplation," end quote, as subsequent generations of listeners have discovered. A lifetime of contemplation in order to appreciate it and absorb it. The complexities, ambiguities, and contradictions of Beethoven's character and legacy, imbricated with the history of the city of Vienna and with the history of classical music, and most recently with contemporary social politics and popular culture, mean that Beethoven continues to stimulate scholarly attention and the popular imagination, even as he recirculates as an increasingly malleable symbol. Who does Beethoven belong to? Perhaps the composer's famous rejoinder to Prince Lichnowsky was short-sighted. Clearly, there is not, nor has there ever been, only one Beethoven. Thank you.